God says, do not let the worries of tomorrow steal the peace I have given you today. God says, your future is in my hands, and I am already there. God says, the burdens you carry are not yours alone to bear. God says, I see the sleepless nights and hear the silent prayers. God says, do not let fear of what is to come dominate your mind. God says, trust me with the plans that you cannot yet understand. God says, let today be filled with faith, not anxiety. God says, tomorrow's storms do not have authority over today's peace. God says, release the chains of worry that bind your heart. God says, I am your refuge when fear knocks at the door. God says, every step you take, I am guiding with divine wisdom. God says, do not borrow trouble from the future. God says, let me carry what you cannot handle. God says, worry will not add a single moment to your life. God says, seek me first, and let my peace rule your heart. God says, when uncertainty rises, I am your certainty. God says, place your trust fully in me and release your fears. God says, the light of today is brighter than the shadow of tomorrow. God says, let your heart be anchored in my promises. God says, surrender the what-ifs to me and be still. God says, you are never alone in facing the unknown. God says, every challenge ahead has my guidance hidden within it. God says, your faith is stronger than any imagined threat. God says, let courage rise from your trust in me. God says, anxiety has no place where my spirit dwells. God says, breathe deeply and feel my presence surrounding you. God says, do not let tomorrow's worries steal today's blessings. God says, I am already working things out that you cannot see. God says, focus on today's victories, not tomorrow's battles. God says, I hold the future, and it is good. God says, do not let fear dictate the choices you make today. God says, let hope be stronger than doubt in your heart. God says, your journey is safe in my hands. God says, tomorrow will come in my perfect timing. God says, the unknown is not empty. It is filled with my plan. God says, trust my timing, even when it seems delayed. God says, anxiety cannot unravel the plans I have for you. God says, rest in my peace, for I am your strength. God says, lift your eyes, for I am already preparing the way. God says, every worry surrendered brings freedom to your soul. God says, do not let fear cloud your vision of my blessings. God says, my love will never let you fall into despair. God says, let gratitude for today replace anxiety for tomorrow. God says, I am the God of impossible possibilities. God says, worry is a thief of joy, but I bring overflowing joy. God says, face each day with the confidence that I am with you. God says, surrender every plan, every desire, and every fear to me. God says, the future is my canvas, and I paint with infinite wisdom. God says, let the peace of my presence rule your heart completely. God says, you cannot predict the future, but you can trust me completely. God says, I am already working miracles you cannot yet see. God says, let your heart rest in my promises instead of worrying. God says, when your mind races with fear, let my spirit calm it. God says, your trust in me is the strongest weapon against anxiety. God says, I am your shield, protecting you from unseen troubles. God says, do not let your thoughts control your destiny. God says, peace is found in surrender, not in control. God says, the future belongs to me, and I have it fully in my hands. God says, anxiety cannot shorten your days or lengthen them. God says, rest in the knowledge that all things work together for good. God says, let each moment today be filled with faith, not fear. God says, I am the author of tomorrow, and it is secure. God says, no trial can surprise me, for I see all that is coming. God says, fear not the unknown, for I am with you. God says, the weight of tomorrow is lifted when you trust me. God says, each heartbeat is guided by my care and love. God says, do not rush ahead with worry. Walk slowly in trust. God says, the path may twist and turn, but I am leading. God says, your faith today creates victory for tomorrow. God says, let your heart be courageous in my presence. God says, peace is your inheritance when you rely on me. God says, tomorrow's challenges are already under my control. God says, Anxiety fades when you focus on my eternal promises. God says, I am your anchor in the storms of uncertainty. God says, lift your mind from fear and lift it toward hope. God says, my Spirit strengthens those who trust fully. God says, fear is powerless where faith resides. God says, do not let worry steal your smile today. God says, I am crafting your future with precision and love. God says, the light of my guidance shines brighter than any shadow. God says, courage grows when you place every tomorrow in my hands. God says, your peace comes from trusting, not from knowing. God says, the unknown is an opportunity for my glory. God says, anxiety cannot touch a heart fully surrendered. God says, your soul can rest in my everlasting arms. God says, do not worry about what you cannot see. God says, focus on today's blessings and leave tomorrow to me. God says, faith is the bridge over the river of fear. God says, every step forward is guided by my wisdom. God says, release tomorrow and live fully in the peace I provide today.